Between Emily, 34, and Sophie, 25, the middle child, I'm a 29-year-old guy. A few months ago, if you had asked, I would have told you my family was close-knit. Yes, we had our eccentricities and sporadic spats, but always we had each other's backs. At least, that is what I thought. It began tiny. I believed I was just out of the loop, missing a joke from the group chat, when I noticed Emily and Sophie giggling about something during family dinners and inquired what was so funny. I got evasive answers like, "Oh, it's nothing." Still, it persisted, and I began to see other things as well. Plans last minute, and I would be the last to know. They would cite something I knew nothing about. Not something I was used to. It seemed like I was the odd man out. The actual turning moment occurred during a family cookout. Sophie was showing Emily something on her phone as we were hanging around the backyard. Up until I asked, they were laughing like schoolgirls. The words stopped as they came out of my mouth. Sophie put her phone into her pocket so quickly you would have expected me to have demanded to view her bank records. She said, "It's nothing," and the discomfort in the air thickened. I laughed it off, but within, I couldn't get rid of the impression they were hiding. Last week at my parents' place, the circumstances reached a breaking point. Her phone buzzed on the table as I was helping her with her laptop. She is hopeless at technology. Out of habit, I looked at the computer and froze at a warning from a group chat called Family Chat. My gut turned over at the message preview. Just don't mention it in front of him today. Family conversation. The family converse. Just what the devil was this? I assumed I belonged in the only family talk we had. You know, the dull one in which we periodically posted a meme and arranged Sunday dinners. Still, this was not that chat. I didn't say anything to my mother. This was something else totally, something I obviously wasn't part of. I departed after finishing helping her, but my head kept whirling the whole drive home. Steer clear of mentioning anything to him today. Not among the things they mentioned? Not what were they telling me? Was it about me? Was my action? Was I the cause of it? I had trouble letting it go. Looking for hints, I searched our family chat on my phone that evening. Nothing at all. Just the typical bland conversations concerning who was bringing dessert or about when someone's child had a school concert. It felt manufactured, like a placeholder to prevent me from seeing there was another. I contacted Jason, my best friend. When my head starts whirling, he is my go-to. I went over everything, the strange stares, the covert conversation, the message I had seen on her phone. Joking that perhaps they were organizing a surprise party or something else, Jason aimed to cool me off. Still, he sounded not quite convinced. He advised me to ask them straightforward questions, but just now I wasn't ready for that. If it wasn't something benign, I didn't want to come out as worried. The following time I saw Sophie, I tread carefully. I asked informally whether I had missed any fresh group talks. She stopped for half a second, then said, "Nope, just the usual one." Her response was too hurried and her voice too strained. That evening, I turned to Reddit just to confirm my concerns. When I looked for family secret chat, I was shocked to come across hundreds of entries featuring others in the same circumstances. Certain people had found that their families were organizing surprises. Others discovered that their families were keeping even deeper secrets. Reading those threads stayed me awake all night. As I considered all the options, my fear shot through. The next day I asked Emily. She would not look me in the eye, and she swiftly changed the topic to her new work project, by which point I could not take it anymore. She performed it less than Sophie. Her expression showed a flutter when I mentioned it. I wasn't going to sit about allowing them to lie to me. That possibility presented itself the following Sunday over a family meal at Emily's place. I resolved I was going to face them. There were my parents, sisters, and Emily's husband, among other people. I joked about how I'd have to mute a few group conversations because they were so active, then gently added, "Hey, are there any group chats I'm not in?" Sophie's new job and the latest movie Emily had seen were on topic. The space froze. Sophie looked at Emily, who stayed fixed on her meal. While my dad continued to eat as though he had not felt the change in the air, my mother got up and began clearing the plates. I waited while my heart hammered. At last I added, I know there's another family chat. Last week, Mom received a notification on her phone. That caught their interest. Emily's face got tighter, and my mother looked very guilty. The smile of Sophie faded totally. Emily spoke first. My dad looked up, perplexed, as though he was trying to catch up with what was occurring, her tone defensive. "It's none of your business," she said, "and you shouldn't be snooping on Mom's phone." I didn't even get a chance to explain before my mom jumped in, trying to diffuse the circumstances. She said, "It's not what you think," but she wouldn't say more. I pressed closer. Why wasn't I included if it's not a major concern? What is so secret I cannot know? At this, Sophie yelled out, "It's not about you, okay?" Her voice broke, and the room went quiet for a time. "Protect me from what?" My heart pounding, I questioned. Sophie clamped down, staring at Emily like she had said too much. With a long sigh, my mother slumped back at the table. She continued gently, "We should have told you sooner." My stomach turned as she began to explain. Apparently, the secret conversation had nothing at all about me. It concerned my dad. They had observed little things over the past year, missing dates, repeating the same stories, becoming perplexed about easy chores. They initially wrote it off as natural aging, but it got worse. They started the chat to arrange visits with doctors and distribute updates. Though they did not yet have a diagnosis, they feared it might be early-onset dementia. I was shocked, as they hadn't told me since they wanted to spare me concern till they were positive. Though I had assumed they were excluding me all this time, they were handling something far more than I could have anticipated. My mom apologized. She said they thought they were sparing me. I felt a sense of shame for jumping to conclusions, but also saddened that they had withheld this from me. Sophie looked as though she would cry, and even Emily seemed startled. Not sure what to say, I got up to go clear my thoughts and phoned Jason everything. Quietly listening, he advised me to inhale and give myself time to gather. Relieved yet depressed at the same time, I stood on the porch peering at the still street. Though the fact of what it was hit me like a stone, I was relieved it was not something sinister. I went back inside and told them I needed time to process. My dad, my solid, trustworthy dad, might be slipping away. Though I was overwhelmed, I was not angry. They nodded in knowing direction. Memories of my dad ran through my head as I drove home. His jokes, his anecdotes, his always knowing of the answer to everything. Things were changing whether or not I was ready. All those minor events I had dismissed, the repeated questions, the lost objects, took on new weight. I avoided socializing for a few days following that supper. I wanted time to digest what I had just discovered. Though texts and missed calls from Emily, Sophie, and even my mother buzzed nonstop on my phone, I couldn't bring myself to answer. I felt overwhelmed, not quite angry with them. Emily finally texted me just saying, "Are you okay?" It felt as though my entire universe had changed overnight, and I needed time to sort out where I stood. "We're here when you're ready." I answered, "I need some time." It wasn't much, but it was all I could muster. Those next few days I kept replaying events with my dad in my thoughts. Many small things then made logical sense, like the times he visited and forgot where I kept the coffee mugs, a place he had known for years, or twice in one day to tell me the same story about his neighbor's dog. I laughed at senior moments at the time, but today those memories seemed weighty. They were signals, not simply random blips. When I found myself unable to stop my ideas from whirling, I went to Google. I looked at all I could regarding early-onset dementia. I perused medical papers, blog entries, and even Reddit discussions featuring others who had gone through it. Real. It felt more like the more I knew. These were not merely possibilities now. It was probably reality, and I despised how helpless it made me feel. Eventually, I realized I could not escape my family indefinitely. "Tell me everything," I replied when I contacted my mother. Her voice immediately struck me as tired. She exhaled deeply and walked me through the past year for the following hour, without secrets. It began small. My dad missed his way on known drives or forgot dates. It thereafter deteriorated. He would struggle to recall simple events like his own birthday, or ignore talks he had recently had. Having seen several doctors with him, my mother and sisters had not received a definite diagnosis. Though they were waiting for more tests, They suspected early onset dementia and wanted not to cause you any stress. Her voice cracked. We thought keeping it quiet would make it easier for everyone. Things did not. That much was obvious. A little later, Sophie phoned. She sounded tense, as though she doubted whether I would even be able to pick up. She expressed how difficult it had been to carry this secret and apologized for dragging me into the dark. I almost told you so many times, she said. Her voice trembled as she spoke. But Emily convinced me to wait. We thought you would fall apart if we told you. You're not fantastic with heavy stuff. That stung, but I knew she was not mistaken. When things get too emotional, I often close down. Still, knowing they didn't believe I could do it stung more than I wanted to acknowledge. We agreed to get together that evening to go over everything as a family at Emily's place. I could feel the tension as soon as I entered. Emily seemed to have not slept in several days. Sophie was staring at the floor like a chastised kid as my mom continued to fumble with her wedding band. I broke the silence as nobody appeared to know how to start. I don't want any more secrets, I shouted angrily. We have to deal with this together if we are to handle it. They all nodded, nearly in unison. Emily said she'd been mistaken to keep me out of it. I believed I was protecting you, she replied, but I understand now that I made it worse. Sophie joined in, her voice quivering. I simply had no idea how to approach it. I told them I understood why they did it, but it still hurt, and I was afraid. Though much remained unspoken, it felt like a tiny step toward healing. The discussion turned to what lay next. We felt Dad needed to be seen by a professional for a better diagnosis. We also discussed long-term care choices, a subject none of us wanted to address, but we knew we couldn't escape. Before I went, we decided on a strategy, even though the thought of preparing for that so quickly seemed like acknowledging defeat. We couldn't deny the reality we were facing. Starting with booking the specialist visit, I offered to help with some of the chores. Emily seemed relieved, most likely since she had been bearing most of the weight up until recently. That evening, I updated my Reddit post. Sophie hugged me as I was leaving, and for the first time in a while, it seemed like we were on the same team once more. I clarified how my dad's health dominated the covert conversation rather than mine. I told the whole tale, including my quick jump to the worst conclusions. The answers flowed in: sympathy, validation, and tales from those who had gone through the same circumstances. One comment stayed with me. It's okay to feel hurt, but don't let that stop you from stepping up. Some told me I was justified in feeling hurt. Others related their own battles with family secrets and dementia. Your family now more than ever needs you. It was the wake-up call I needed. Over the next 3 days, I poured myself into investigating experts and treatments. Though I had no clear idea exactly what I was looking for, I felt I had to do something, anything, to help. I finally located a highly rated specialist and made plans. Mom and my sisters were ecstatic, but the weight in my chest would not go away. Every stride ahead seemed to serve as a reminder of how serious this all was. I also began to see more indications in my dad. One afternoon, something we used to do quite a lot when I was a child, we visited the park. He related to me a story about feeding the ducks when he was a youngster while we strolled. It was lovely and nostalgic until he told me the identical tale once more, 5 minutes later. I spoke nothing. Though inside I was crushed, I nodded and grinned. Seeing the symptoms personally made them all the more real. The specialist visit passed. Thoroughly completing a battery of tests and posing hundreds of questions, the doctor was later confiding in me privately, saying the symptoms matched early-onset dementia, even though they couldn't yet verify anything. He suggested a different specialist for more assessment and described some next actions. That evening, we met at Emily's once again to discuss everything. I went over everything the doctor had said as well as the forward course. Emily jotted notes, Sophie nodded, my mother simply stared, fatigued. It felt like we were really in this together for the first time. We agreed to create a common calendar to manage obligations and appointments. Though it was little, it seemed like improvement. Before I went, I apologized to my mom and sisters for excluding them earlier, like we were beginning to take charge of something that had been so disorderly. I am in now, I said. Whatever that means, I'm here. Emily offered me a little worn-out smile. Good, she responded. Because we need you, I thought as I drove home that evening. Relief, terror, and a fresh will mixed together. Though I had no idea what the future contained, I knew one thing. I would not let my family bear it on their own. A few days following our family conference, I discovered myself fixated on the agreed-upon shared calendar. Notes, reminders, and appointments were already stuffing it. Seeing it all organized like that gave everything greater reality and overwhelming weight. My first chore was driving Dad to his next doctor's visit. I had promised something and meant to keep it. Emily and Sophie were relieved when I offered to help since, up until now, they had been handling most of the logistics. Thanks, Emily replied. You have no idea how much this helps. I picked Dad up that morning and he seemed to be in a good mood. He mentioned the trees lining the road as we traveled, remarking on the vivid colors at this time of year. Up until he repeated the same statement 3 times in 10 minutes, it felt like a regular chat. I nodded and grinned each time, not wanting to make him uncomfortable. Still, within it struck me hard. Little by bit, the man who had always been so keen and consistent was losing it. The doctor drew me aside following the appointment to go over the findings. He verified what we had been suspicious about. Early onset dementia was the most likely diagnosis. He clarified that although a cure was not possible, there were drugs meant to slow down the development. I nodded, trying to take in all he advised, seeing an expert to get a more definite plan in place. Though I knew I couldn't break apart, the reality of it felt like weight crushing down on my chest. Not right now. Dad expected me to be strong, even if I didn't feel like I was. That evening, we met at Emily's place to review what the doctor had said. I told everything, including the diagnosis, possible drugs, and future actions. Emily began furiously writing notes right away, while Sophie sat silently staring at the table. Though my mother spoke little as well, I could tell she was absorbing everything. We have to decide on the medication, I continued. The doctor cautioned that although there are hazards, it might help things slow down. Side effects include mood swings, bewilderment, and even violence. Sophie looked up, her face pallid. Aggressiveness? Emily sighed, obviously annoyed, and I wondered whether I could manage it. Soph, we are not free to choose. We have to see if it allows Dad even a little more time. The discussion soon descended into a fight. While Sophie shot back, claiming Emily was always attempting to control everything, Emily accused Sophie of being too emotional. Except, this time, the stakes were so much more. Enough! I shouted, cutting them off, feeling like we were kids again battling over who got the final cookie. Here we are all on the same team. They both grudgingly agreed, but the tension in the room was strong. The next day I contacted the expert the doctor had advised and managed to schedule an appointment for later that week. We should chill off and conduct more research before doing anything. Though I knew our road ahead was lengthy, it seemed like a little triumph. I threw myself into study in the meanwhile, reading everything I could on the drug and its effects. Before we decided, I wanted to be as knowledgeable as possible. When we met the specialist at last, he was cool-headed and exhaustive, emphasizing that although the medicine would slow down the development, it was not a sure fix. He detailed the possible advantages and hazards. It's a gamble, he continued, and you'll need to monitor him closely for any changes. After the appointment, I could see the uncertainty on everyone's face. The same thought kept us all wondering, was the possible advantage worth the danger? We convened once more as a family that evening to go over our choices. Emily was quite in favor of testing the medicine. We have to do everything we can, she maintained. Sophie was reluctant. We owe it to Dad. What if it makes things worse? Suppose he no longer remembers us. Her voice cracked, and I saw tears building up in her eyes. I started to play mediator once more. Let's give it a shot, I said, but gently. After a protracted, emotional conversation, we at last agreed. Should we notice any unfavorable changes, we will cease right away. Though it wasn't a simple choice, it seemed like the best one for now. The first few days on the drug went without incident. Dad seemed as usual, and I began to get some hope. Perhaps this would really help. But then the aggressiveness began. Initially, it was subdued, snapping at us over minor events or being more quickly frustrated than normal. But it turned rapidly more intense. He slung his coffee mug across the kitchen one morning when Sophie asked a basic inquiry. We all stopped. The sound of it breaking on the floor sounded like a gunshot. The hardest part was witnessing the bewilderment on Dad's face afterward. Sophie started crying, Emily, and I just stood there shocked. The outbursts were more regular, and it crushed my heart as he seemed to not know why he had responded that way. There were times when he would yell at Sophie to get out of his house, accusing Emily of pilfering his belongings or not recognizing us. That was terrible. Though side effects were expected, none like this. We returned to Emily's place once more to try to decide what to do. Declared unable to handle seeing Dad like this anymore, Sophie was a wreck. Even Emily, generally the strong one, acknowledged she was afraid. She was in a rare state of vulnerability, and it dawned on me just how deeply this was affecting all of us. "We cannot do this alone," I murmured at last. "We need help." Both of them nodded, worn out and demoralized. We decided to stop the medicine and investigate at least part-time professional caregiver hire. Though it was not what any of us wanted, it was obvious we could not continue like this. That evening I turned to Reddit once more. Though I hadn't posted in a while, I had to let everything out of my mind. I wrote on the choice to try the drug, the violent bouts, and our difficulties adjusting. I also sought counsel from anyone who had gone through something like this. The answers were really overwhelming. Individuals offered advice, encouragement, and support as they related their personal experiences with handling dementia. While some advised we cease the drug right away, others advised tools for locating expert caretakers. Reading through those comments helped me feel less alone. It reassured me that, although solitary as this all felt, there were people out there who understood. We decided to stop the medications and concentrate on selecting a caretaker. After a few days, the hostility began to soften, but we knew this was only the beginning of a long, challenging road. As I sat in my quiet apartment that evening, browsing Reddit, I felt a weird mix of weariness and relief. Though we still have a lot of questions, for the first time I felt as though we were headed on the correct path. And right now, that was sufficient. Though the weeks following medication discontinuation were difficult, things began to calm down. Dad seemed calmer, but the memory losses persisted even as the angry bouts grew less frequent. We knew we couldn't continue without assistance, so we began the difficult search for a professional caregiver, not only seeking someone qualified, but also for someone who could relate to Dad, someone who wouldn't treat him like another patient. Leading by example, Emily contacted agencies and scheduled interviews. When we could, Sophie and I participated. Unfortunately, it felt like a never-ending procession of applicants who didn't quite fit. Some were too clinical, rattling off their credentials without any compassion. Some were nice, but lacked the experience we knew was required. It was aggravating, and after some time I began to question whether we would ever meet the ideal partner. Then we met Karen, who was in her 50s and exuded peace and warmth. She asked intelligent questions about Dad during the interview, not just about her credentials. "What brings him happiness?" she questioned. "What helps him cool off when he gets angry?" She obviously cared about forging a connection, not only about finding a job. We all decided by the conclusion of the conference, she was the one. The day Karen started, I had no idea how things would turn out. Dad wasn't always brilliant with new people, so I thought he may object. Karen, nevertheless, managed it like a master. She spent some time sitting with him, inquiring about his favorite pastimes and listening as he related his early years. Whether he told the same stories, it made no difference. She treated every one of them as though it were the first time she had heard it. Observing her deal with him was like seeing someone cast magic. He seemed more relaxed, and for the first time in weeks, I sensed a sliver of hope. Perhaps after all, we could establish a new normal. Having Karen around really helped to lighten our responsibilities. It allowed us the time to be his family rather than his caregivers, and to breathe. After Emily at last slept for the first night in months, Sophie began attending yoga lessons to help her relax. More than that, Karen brought laughing. Even I found myself unwinding in ways I hadn't experienced before all of this began. Even on Dad's worst days, she had a talent for highlighting his better qualities. I visited one afternoon to see they were both laughing like old friends, playing cards at the kitchen table. Though it was a little moment, it meant everything. My sisters and I discovered we were reconnecting too as things began to steady. For so long, the tension of caring for Dad dominated our interactions. One evening, we gathered at Emily's house for what we termed a family de-stress night. We ordered pizza, drank wine, and reminisced about our childhood now, time and energy to simply be siblings once more. Emily and I laughed so hard we almost started to cry when Sophie related how she became lost in the zoo at the age of 5. It seemed as though we had traveled back in time for a few hours before life was so convoluted. Of course, nothing was perfect. My mom's sister, Aunt Lisa, decided to pay an unplanned visit. Living out of state and only seeing Dad at Christmas, she had not participated in any of this so far. She arrived today, though, with a lot of ideas and very little tact. "You should have put him in a facility months ago," she stated, as if she had been there from the start. Her words ripped right through, and I could see Sophie's face fall apart. Always the diplomat, Emily tried to explain why we had decided to look after Dad at home, but Lisa wasn't listening. Though she hadn't helped, she behaved as though we were failing him. I'm not sure what came over me, but I grabbed. "You don't get to criticize us when you've been sitting on the sidelines," I remarked, my voice harder than I meant. "We are the daily handlers of this. If you wanted a voice, you should have been here." Lisa looked shocked, as though nobody had ever dared challenge her before. Emily and Sophie said little, but their nodding indicated me they were happy someone had stood up to her. After Lisa went, we rested in the living room, worn, but together. We had not felt like a team in a very long time. We came to see that we had to keep together no matter how difficult things grew. Should we not, the guilt and tension would pull us apart. That evening we made another crucial choice. We needed a plan. We could not simply respond to disasters now. We decided to have frequent family meetings, Karen coming sometimes to report Dad's development. A few days later I wrote another update on Reddit. It felt proactive, like we were at last regaining control over a circumstance that had been ruling us for so long. I told how Karen had turned into a lifesaver, how we had turned down Aunt Lisa's unwelcome counsel, and how my sisters and I were beginning to mend our relationship. Encouragement abounded in the comments as individuals related their own tales of finding fortitude under trying circumstances. "It's not about doing it perfect," one user said. "It's about doing it together." That sentence really stuck with me since, for the first time in months, I felt like we were discovering a rhythm. Of course, difficult days still abound. Dad's memory kept fading, and occasionally he would not know us. More than I could say, those times hurt. Good days too. Like when he grinned at me like he used to, or laughed at one of Karen's jokes. I watched the sun drop with him on the deck one afternoon. "You're a good kid, you know that," he remarked, turning to me. Though it seemed so basic, it really spoke to me straight in the heart. There were still times like this that brought back his character, even as bits of him vanished. That evening, as I went home, I considered all we had gone through, the secrets, the conflicts, the choices we never would have had to make. It never would be, and was not flawless either. However, for the first time, I felt as though we were in it together, confronting whatever lay ahead for our family. For now, that was plenty as well. The next several weeks seemed to be a careful balancing act. We found some reprieve with Karen helping Dad with his care, but his disease always dominated. Good days when he would laugh at old jokes or recall minute details. Horrible days when he would completely forget who we were. One evening, following a particularly demanding day, Sophie called me in tears. "I'm not sure how much more of this I can handle," she said. She had spent the afternoon with Dad and Karen, and he had become disoriented, accusing her of being a stranger attempting to pilfer his belongings. Though Karen had helped him to cool off, Sophie was disturbed. Her voice cracking, she said, "It's like he's not even Dad anymore." I couldn't find any consoling responses. "I know," I murmured gently. "I find it too as well." Karen raised something we had been avoiding at our next family meeting. The notion of long-term planning. Her voice soft but firm, she said, "You're all doing an amazing job. But home care might not be sufficient at one point." Her comments floated in the air like a dense fog. Though none of us wanted to say it aloud, we knew what she meant. Assisted living or a memory aid center. I hated that since it felt like acknowledging failure. First to speak out was Emily. "We're not there yet," she said with great conviction. "For now, we can handle this. Sophie looked doubtful, her eyes darting to me for encouragement. I nodded gradually. "She is correct. Let us cross that bridge when we get to it." Karen did not press. "Just promise me you will think about it," she said. "Having a plan in place is preferable to scrambling should something go wrong." We couldn't ignore the truth, even if we so wanted to avoid the conversation. Dad's illness was not going to improve. Though it was a difficult pill to chew, it made us consider our next moves. While Sophie and I concentrated on keeping things steady at home, Emily led on investigating nearby facilities. Though we were resolved to make it work for as long as we could, it was not an easy balance. One afternoon, I stopped by to visit Dad. Karen had taken him out for a walk, so it was just the two of us sitting on the porch. For a while, we didn't say much, just watching the cars go by. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "I don't want to leave this house." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't said anything about assisted living, so I wasn't sure where it was coming from, but I could see the fear in his eyes, and it broke me. "You don't have to worry about that right now," I said, my voice steady even though my heart felt like it was breaking. "We're going to take care of you, Dad." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. "You're a good kid," he said softly. "Don't let them take me away." I didn't know how to respond. I just sat there, holding his hand, wishing I could promise him something I wasn't sure I could keep. The next family meeting was tense. Emily brought printouts from a few facilities she'd visited, and Sophie looked like she was about to cry the whole time. I stayed quiet for most of it, letting them hash out the pros and cons. But when the conversation started to spiral into frustration and guilt, I stepped in. "We're not making any decisions right now," I said firmly, "but we need to be prepared. If something happens and we're not ready, it'll be worse for all of us, especially Dad." That seemed to calm things down, but the weight of the conversation lingered. None of us wanted to think about losing the version of Dad we knew. Even though he was already slipping away. Around this time, Aunt Lisa decided to make another appearance. She called out of the blue, saying she wanted to check in and see how things were going. I could feel my patience wearing thin before the conversation even started. When she showed up, it was more of the same, criticizing our decisions, suggesting we weren't doing enough, and offering unsolicited advice. This time, though, we didn't let her steamroll us. Emily calmly explained everything we'd been doing, while Sophie pointed out how little Lisa had been involved. "I appreciate your concern," I said, my tone polite but firm. "But unless you're willing to step up and help, we've got this handled." Lisa didn't have much to say after that. She left in a huff, but I didn't care. For once, I felt like we'd stood our ground as a family. Despite the challenges, there were still moments of light. One evening, Karen organized a game night for Dad. She pulled out an old deck of cards and taught him a simple game that didn't require much memory. Watching him laugh as he played reminded me of the Dad I'd grown up with, the one who could find joy in the smallest things. Those moments felt like gifts, reminders that even in the midst of everything, there was still love and connection. That night, I updated my Reddit post. I wrote about the struggles of balancing hope and reality, about the tough conversations we were having as a family, and about the small moments of joy that kept us going. The responses were, as always, a mix of empathy and encouragement. One comment stood out. "You're not failing by considering assisted living. You're making sure he gets the care he needs. That's love too." I read that comment over and over, letting it sink in. It didn't make the decision any easier, but it helped me see things from a different perspective. As the weeks went on, We continued to take things one day at a time. Some days were harder than others, but we leaned on each other in ways we hadn't before. Emily, Sophie, and I weren't simply siblings anymore. We were a team, and no matter what came next, I knew we'd face it together. For now, that was enough. The days began to blur together as we fell into a pattern. With Karen's aid, we managed to keep Dad at home for longer than we'd previously believed possible. But the inevitability of what lay ahead was always in the back of our minds. We had plans in place, but none of us wanted to pull the trigger on them until we absolutely had to. Then, one evening, everything changed. I got a call from Karen just as I was getting ready for bed. "Something's wrong," she continued, her voice steady but frantic. "Your dad's confused more than usual. He doesn't know where he is and he's refusing to settle down." I pulled on some clothes and drove to the house. When I arrived, Emily and Sophie were already there, both looking pale and scared. Dad was seated in his chair, his face a mix of dread and frustration. He mistook us for strangers attempting to take him away, and every time we tried to speak with him, he screamed out. That episode was the worst we had ever seen. Even Karen, who had coped with this sort of thing for years, appeared unsettled. Though we tried for hours to cool him down, nothing worked. We eventually had to phone an on-call physician, who advised a moderate sedative to assist with restfulness. It was anguish as much as relief to see him at last nod off. A shadow of the guy who had always seemed to be larger than life, he appeared so tiny and delicate. Later, worn out and emotionally spent, the three of us sat in the living room. Quietly, Sophie whispered, her voice shaking, "We cannot keep doing this. For him and for us, too much is involved." Emily nodded, a gloomy look on her. "I consider it to be time." Though I knew they were right, I didn't want to own it. Even if it hurt, we were unable to provide Dad the required attention on our own anymore. That was the moment to advance. The next week was a swirl of phone calls, documentation, and tough talks. Not far from our house, we chose a memory care center we had visited previously, but hadn't considered we would need just now. The personnel was friendly, the surroundings were quiet, and it seemed as near to home as we could want. That day we moved, and Dad was among the toughest of my life. Confused and hostile, he asked repeatedly why he could simply stay at home. Though I tried to clarify, the words felt hollow. How would you approach someone who cannot completely grasp something like this? Karen eventually intervened, guiding him gently yet firmly to ease his change. That evening, when we exited the facility, in the parking lot, Sophie broke down. She said, crying, "It feels like we're abandoning him." I gave her a firm hug. My own tears threatened to flow over. "We're not," I answered, not sure if I believed it personally. "We are acting in his best interests." The next few weeks were an emotional roller coaster. Seeing Dad in the institution was gut-wrenching as well as consoling. On certain days, he would brighten when he saw us and tell us tales akin to nothing having changed. On other days, he stared blankly or thought of us as servants, not at all familiar. Looking at me one afternoon on a visit, he remarked, "You remind me of my son. He is a nice young man." Smiling, I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I am your son, Dad." He stopped, his brow wrinkling, and for a few seconds I sensed a flash of identification. "Oh," he murmured gently, "that's great." Karen kept being a lifesaver for us among all this. Her duties as Dad's caretaker had been stopped, but she checked in often, providing emotional support and guidance. She told me one day something I will never forget. "You're not losing him all at once. You're merely losing bits. Hang on to the ones you still own." Her comments stayed with me, and I began to pay close attention to the little events. Dad's face came alive when he listened to an old tune he loved, the way he would still chuckle at ridiculous jokes, even after he forgot them a short while later. Those few bits turned into everything. Things seemed oddly quiet at home. We had more time to contemplate and process things without the continual caregiving obligations. Emily poured herself into her work, while Sophie began to keep a notebook to sort through her emotions. Spending hours leafing through old photo albums, I discovered I was trying to hang on to memories that seemed to be fading. We began leaning more on one another, getting together often to discuss our coping mechanisms and how we may keep Dad supported. For all of us, those gatherings turned into sort of therapy, a means of negotiating the complex mix of guilt, grief, and relief. Dad had a rare flash of insight one day during a visit. "You kids are doing a great job," he remarked, looking at Emily, Sophie, and me. "I commend you. We all knew it." This was the last time he had ever spoken something like that. We clung to their words like a priceless treasure carried around. That evening, I put my last Reddit update online. I told everything: the trip to the memory care center, our challenges, and the little triumphs we had along the road. With hundreds of people lending words of encouragement and sharing their own experiences, the answer was astounding. "Love isn't just about what you can do for someone," one reply caught out to me. "It's about being present, even under trying circumstances." We changed with time to fit our new reality. Dad's illness grew worse and the visits grew less frequent, but we made sure he never spent long alone. Emily, Sophie, and I began to pay more attention to our own lives once more, striking a fresh balance and still maintaining contact. One afternoon, on a quiet visit, I sat with Dad in the garden of the institution. With a slight smile on his face, he was fixated on the flowers. Though it was not important, I was not sure whether he knew me. We were united at that moment. That was plenty. Looking back, I saw that this trip had taught me more about love and fortitude than I could have ever imagined. It was not about doing everything flawlessly or undoing unchangeable circumstances. It was about showing up, even in trying circumstances, and clinging to the events that really counted. Closing my last Reddit post, I wrote, "Cherish the little moments. When all else fades, they are the ones you remember." And with that, I started to let go, not of Dad, but of the guilt and the terror. Though I understood the road ahead would still be difficult, I also knew we would be walking it together one step at a time.